Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. Today, we're going to have a conversation about the social construct of whiteness. Now, before you roll your eyes and reach to change the channel, hear me out. Race is not a biological truth. It's a social construct. Historically, race has been used to divide us human beings, so we focus more on our differences rather than our shared humanity. And because of whiteness being a social construct, that thing has changed over time. Today, most people would say that Irish and Italian Americans are white. But a few hundred years ago, that would not be the case. Later this hour, we'll talk about how the concept of whiteness has developed here in Tennessee. But first, Christian nationalism has been on the rise this election season, and nationally, right-wing candidates have been using Christian nationalist messaging. It's all happening here in Tennessee as well. Liam Adams is a religion reporter for the Tennessean. He's been following this trend, and he joins me now. Liam, welcome back, and thanks for being here.
Thanks. It's great to be here again.
All right, so let's start by understanding what Christian nationalism is. Can you give us a definition?
Yeah, Christian nationalism is a phrase that generally refers to this belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and sort of proponents of these views sort of see contemporary political forces as a threat to some of those Christian ideals that they consider part of the nation's founding. In the candidates that I was looking at in Tennessee, you'll see a lot of messaging around this idea of personal liberties, and some of the issues they, were focusing on are sort of heavily focused on cultural and religious issues. So whether that's school curricula or LGBTQ rights. I also saw messaging around public health guidelines and the Second Amendment. I'll add that right before my recent story came out, the Pew Research Center released results of a recent survey on Christian nationalism, and it found that 45% of Americans believe the U.S. should be a quote-unquote Christian nation. And among those respondents, 28% said they want the federal government to formally recognize that idea.
So, you tapped on some of the cultural issues that they're focusing on a lot for this. How widespread has this become politically?
Well, it's, I think the Pew Research Center survey offered sort of some numerical, it offered helpful data, but there's also this sort of element of, maybe some politicians are using this idea because it's popular among some voters. But then there are also, as I sort of explored a little more in my story, this idea of those who are sort of true believers committed to this cause. And so they're it's appealing to different kinds of people for different reasons.
Okay, so how is this all playing out locally here?
Yeah, my story, it focused on a few candidates, Republican candidates in Tennessee, who are promoting these ideas and focusing on these issues. This story, sort of one of the main characters, if you will, of my story is Andy Ogles, the Republican nominee for the 5th Congressional District, who, I went to his primary election campaign event back in August. And, more than anything else, he was talking about God and America's Christian roots. But that's not where Andy Ogles started. And so my story kind of looked at, the roots of that and some of the issues that, sort of Andy pivoted around.
We have some of tape from that congressional district primary in August, his victory speech and some of that language. Let's listen.
This is a political war, a cultural war, and it's a spiritual war. And as we go forward, we've got to get back to honoring God and country.
Okay, so tell me, when you heard that, what were you thinking?
I immediately recognized the language to match what sort of experts and scholars are saying is Christian nationalism. What stood out to me that night, and I was actually there not even to cover religion, it was just to help out our politics team with the primary election coverage. But that night I also learned about Andy's sort of background as the first state director for Americans for Prosperity, which is a sort of libertarian and conservative political advocacy group that sort of rose to prominence during the Tea Party era. And that was sort of really interesting to me, that he sort of started his political career in many ways around the sort of tax issue. And yet he was using, sort of language about a spiritual and cultural war. And so that kind of, in a lot of ways, was the inspiration for the story, where I sort of traced sort of Andy's journey, but that sort of similarly of other Republicans in Tennessee who kind of have a similar backstory to Andy.
He's not that only politician to make that sort of jump, right?
Correct. And there are sort of national figures who have caught, sort of headlines for using this kind of rhetoric. My story also, in addition to Andy, had looked at several Republicans running for office or for re-election for State House of Representatives. And
what do you, sorry to interrupt, but what do you credit that shift in messaging to? Where did it come from?
So I think I'll go back to Andy, and then I'll bring up another example that I came across, where there was this. So Andy had this background with Americans for Prosperity and lobbying for lower taxes, and then later became the mayor of Murray County, where he gained attention for resisting COVID-19 public health guidelines. And there's sort of this anti-establishment, sort of. I actually have a quote from a historian that I think sort of puts this as sort of more succinctly than I can. This is from Daniel K. Williams. He's the author of he's the author of Daniel K. Williams. He's the author of God's Own Party, The Making of the Christian Right. And he had said to me, pro-business conservatives and Christian conservatives find a lot of common ground. They tend to see churches and Christian institutions as a good thing, and the so-called woke culture as very problematic and very dangerous. And so you see this sort of similar spirit between sort of the activism around fiscal, sort of conservative ideals, to resisting COVID-19 public health guidelines, to then, engaging other issues such as, what's being taught in public schools and LGBTQ rights.
What about this rhetoric from Christian nationalists? What does it really do to worry people?
Well, in my reporting, some of the criticism was that those who are promoting Christian nationalist ideas and sort of are doing so in defense of these ideas of personal liberties are infringing on other people's rights. Those who are, some of the candidates that I looked at don't see it that way. They see it sort of as an issue of right or wrong. Another example that I looked at a lot, I focused on a lot in my story, was State Representative Jason Zachary from Knoxville, who's been very involved in this campaign against sort of gender-affirming treatment at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And, Representative Zachary had said to me, he's like, this doesn't even have to do with religion. And yet you're seeing that controversy appeal to sort of Christian supporters. A couple weeks ago at the rally at War Memorial Plaza, there was a lot of Christian imagery. And so, there's this tension between, personal liberties and the rights of the community. I'll add that sort of I spoke with a pastor in Murfreesboro who's seeing similar conflict play out. And he had taken a sort of different outlook on it, where he said, at the end of the day, it's a leveraging of faith to really push personal preference. So this is Pastor James McCarroll at First Baptist Church in Murfreesboro. And, he was talking to me more about sort of the dynamics of power than, and sees it more dealing with power than it is sort of this idea of, sort of divinely inspired rights.
So what are you going to keep an eye out for as you continue to cover this story?
Well, I think a big part of my story that I sort of sought to explore and sort of sort through was this idea between sort of the oldness and the newness, where, you have the sort of political circumstances that have contributed to this rise in Christian nationalism. Those have been there for a while, but yet we're also seeing this sort of new era of Christian political mobilization. So going back to Daniel Williams, the author of God's Own Party, he had told me that, this is what he said. He said, I don't foresee the Christian right returning to what it was in the 1980s and the 1990s. I see instead this continuing to be a decentralized movement that reflects a larger national culture of conservative politics and that has individual media figures that come and go. So you have this history of sort of national figures who set the agenda for the Christian right in many ways. And now, you're seeing it catch more at the local level through, battles over school boards and hospitals, for example.
Liam Adams is a religion reporter for the Tennessean. You can find the link to his story on this episode's post online at thisisnashville.org. Liam, as always, thanks for being here and thank you for your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about the social construct of whiteness. How has it taken shape here in Tennessee? Join the conversation. Tweet us at thisisnashville. We'll be right back.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Akolona, and this is Nashville. Today, we're talking about the social construct of whiteness. In the United States, it's not something that people think about every day because for centuries, whiteness has been considered the norm or default. The idea of whiteness carries a complicated history, and it's changed shape over time. Generations ago, the Irish, Italian, and Polish were not considered to be white. But if you ask most people today, and yes, most people would define them as white. So, how has that idea of whiteness evolved? And what does it look like here in Tennessee? To learn more about this, I'm excited to introduce my next guest. Tim Wise is a native Nashvilleian. He's an anti-racist writer, educator, and historian. He's the author of several books, including White Like Me, Dear White America, and White Lives Matter, Race, Crime, and the Politics of Fear. Tim Wise, welcome to This Is Nashville.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Really appreciate you being here. So, I'd like to get your definition on the concept of whiteness?
Oh, gosh. It should be the easiest question, and you had to ask it because now it'll be the hardest one, I think. Whiteness is fundamentally a myth that was created for very particular purposes in the 17th century in the colonies of what would become the United States. It was not tied to any notion of science. It was not tied to any notion of a uniform European culture. Whiteness was this umbrella under which all these distinct European peoples would be gathered for the purpose of aggrandizing property and power and access and opportunity to themselves at the expense of either Africans who were brought to the colonial spot for and to what would become America for labor, or indigenous people whose land was being taken. So whiteness was essentially an organizing principle. It was a political project, had nothing to do with the color of skin. You're taking people who look very different and whose cultures and religions are very different and saying, well, we know you think you're Scottish and you think you're German and you think later you're Irish, Italian, Polish, whatever, but actually what we need you to be now is this other thing. And there was a very particular purpose that the elite of the colonies had in mind when they did that, which was if we can get all these folks who actually been killing each other for history, all of history, hated each other, all kinds of conflicts in the old countries, so to speak. If we can get them all on the same team, then it's going to be easier to take this land and control these black folks. And so it was really a trick that was played by the elite on really landless peasants to make them angrier at black people and indigenous people than they were at the rich people who were actually exploiting them every day.
So what did that mean for these, penniless peasants, these people who were not included in the group, particularly of the aristocracy? What did it mean for them to suddenly be considered white or in this more privileged, preferred group of people?
What it meant was that they were now going to be paid what the great sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, right? They weren't going to necessarily own land. They certainly weren't going to have power, but they were going to be better off than somebody, right? And the psychological wage is one that says, well, I might not have much, but I got more than that guy. It's about not being last place, right? And if you think about it, it worked. I mean, here we are in the American South where 600,000 people died in a civil war, roughly half of those Confederates fighting for a system that was predicated on the ownership of other human beings, fighting for a government, a breakaway government that said its purpose was to maintain the system of slavery. I know we lie about it now. We say it wasn't about that. But at the time, they had no shame. They said that's what it was. And yet, who did the dying? Rich people didn't die. Rich people don't go fight wars, right? Rich people send poor people to fight wars for them. So you had a bunch of poor, quote unquote, white people in the South going and fighting for a system that actually didn't even benefit them. Because if you think about it, if I'm a rich landowner and I can hire you to work on my farm for $1 a day because you charge me, or I can get a black guy to do it because I own him and I don't have to pay him anything, you actually would be better off with the job and not with the system of enslavement. But these poor white people were like, yeah, I'll go fight to maintain your stuff. I'll go fight to maintain your property. Like, that doesn't make sense unless you understand that whiteness was this trick that was played to make people feel superior to somebody, even as they're getting their pocket picked.
Fast forward generations, I may get the quote wrong, but Lyndon Baines Johnson said, if I can convince the poorest white man that he's better than the richest black man, I'll have his vote forever. So how did this play out here in Tennessee? Was Tennessee any different?
Well, I mean, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And different parts of Tennessee, it played out differently. During the Civil War, for instance, East Tennessee didn't want to break away at all, had no desire to join this thing called the Confederacy. Why? Well, because East Tennessee wasn't nearly as reliant on plantation labor. It wasn't as reliant on the system of enslavement. These were mountain folks, right? And so to them, it was like, we don't want to form a new country. It's why West Virginia became West Virginia, right? The western part of Virginia was like, we got nothing to do with y'all in Richmond. Like, we don't get down with that. We want to stay in the Union. And in the case of Tennessee, the governor had to send troops to force East Tennessee to break away, which is why it's so funny when you're like in and around Knoxville and folks are flying Confederate flags. Like, read a book, just read a book, Google that, because it makes no sense. Or if you're in West Virginia flying a Confederate flag, like what are you doing? In Middle Tennessee, it's interesting. My family, my mom's dad's people, who were the McLeans of Western Scotland, they came here to Middle Tennessee as part of the Over Mountain Men who came from North Carolina and settled here, and they were among the first families of Nashville and all that. And like most of the people at that time who came, you know, they were owners of other human beings. They developed their whiteness, even though they had been mountain people and rural folk in North Carolina. They became this sort of, not the elite necessarily, as some were, but they were certainly this second strata of it. And to them, I think whiteness became this way to gain entry into that world. But then later, you know, the same thing would happen to the Jewish side of my family. That was my dad's people who came. And, you know, my grandfather grew up on Jefferson Street in the heart of the black community, because at the time when he and his family moved from Chattanooga, Jews, unless they were very wealthy, that's where you lived. I mean, that was where you were restricted and you lived in the black community. But he still got sent to the white school. They didn't send him to Pearl, which was literally down the road. They sent him to Hume Fogg, which was a couple miles away, you know, on Broadway. And so he was also imbibing whiteness. He was also being told, even though these are the people you live around, these are the people you recreate with, this is the community you know, but you're not really, you know, don't be with them. You got to be with these other people over here. And so I think it's not that it developed differently. It developed very similarly. The one thing that is different maybe about Nashville in particular is that Nashville spent so much time being proud of not being Birmingham that we ignored our own role in maintaining white supremacy. Because you go back to the 50s and 60s, that was the thing. Like, well, at least we're not Birmingham, we're not Selma, we're not Montgomery. You know, we're not blowing things up. You don't see bombs in churches every week. Well, you know, there was a bomb at Hattie Cotton Elementary. There was a bomb at the Jewish Community Center. You know, there were bombings and there was violence. But for the most part, we prided ourselves on that whole Athens of the South. Look at all these colleges. We're so educated. We had this big thing at Centennial Park where we, you know, like the pseudo World's Fair in 1890, whatever it was, we're better. But for black folks, segregation was segregation. You know, for black folks, violence was violence. Institutional oppression was institutional oppression. So I think the way whiteness developed differently, to white people, it was a kinder, gentler whiteness. I'm not sure that it always felt that way to black folks.
You know, you touched on something that I've lived here just over a year.
Yeah.
And people are like, Nashville is the Athens of the South. And when friends who are not from here ask me to describe Nashville, I'm like, well, there's a sophisticated air that they have to it.
Yeah.
By not being the Birmingham, by not being Montgomery or Selma, and having some of the more, I would say, ugly events that we remember throughout history.
Right.
You know, desegregation, let's talk about, because, you know, in other parts of the country, desegregation efforts were very ugly. Big, ugly fight. You know, we've seen images of little black girls being escorted by military members and members of the police while angry white crowds shout at them. Nashville wants you to believe that that didn't happen here.
Yeah.
But I know for a fact that it did. A former guest that we had, Janine Blackman, was on, and Barbara Watson. They told us about their experiences as young children who went through that. You know?
Yeah. There were white folks that were lining the streets with anti-busing signs. You know, I started public school here in Nashville in 1974. Graduated in 1986, and busing didn't start till 71. So I was one of the first wave, you know, of students. But I happened to live in a zone that was easier for busing in where I was. So I grew up in Green Hills, like a lot of white middle class kids did, and the black kids that I went to school with lived like right over. Now we call it 12 South. It was just Granny White Pike when I was growing up, and so it wasn't hard for them to come over to John Trotwood Moore over off Granny White. It was easy to go to Stokes, to go to Burton, to go to Hillsborough. So our zone, there was not as much conflict, and I think people look at that and it's like a false sense of security. But if you were in other parts of the city that were much more racially divided, where the distance was not just like a mile and a half or a couple of miles, or in some cases a few blocks, but like miles and miles away, there was a lot of conflict. You had white parents that were absolutely indignant about the thought of black people coming into their community, and they didn't want to go to the black community. You know, that's one of the reasons that the black schools, I mean, Washington Junior High School was shut down. It was probably the crown jewel of junior highs in this city. Pearl was closed. Pearl was one of the finest high schools in the entire Southeast, but it was closed because, well, white kids aren't going to want to go over there, and now we don't have enough demand for that school. Black teachers were laid off. Black counselors were laid off. Black principals were fired because we didn't need them all anymore. You know, we just need all these white educators. So yeah, it didn't, you didn't have bombs killing 4 children in a basement of the church like in Birmingham every week. You didn't have, Birmingham was known as Bombingham for a reason. But we did have that violence. We did have sit-in protesters who were beaten and hauled away to jail. We did have the bombing at Hattie Cotton in 57. We did have the bombing at the Jewish Community Center in 58. And we did have parents that were out yelling at children. It wasn't as bad, but, it comes a point where if you're on a scale of 1 to 10, of the violence and you're at a 4 and someone else is at a 9, if you're comparing yourself to the 9, you're missing the point. You ought to be at a 0, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekolona. We're talking this hour about the social construct of whiteness with anti-racism author and educator Tim Wise. Okay, so as you were growing up here, how did you grapple with that narrative that Nashville wants to tell about the realities about the narrative they wants to tell, but against the realities of life?
Well, I was very fortunate to grow up with parents that I had good home training, as we say, right? So I was raised right. I went to Tennessee State for preschool, actually. So some of my earliest peers, but also authority figures, were black folks, black women that ran the preschool program at TSU. I learned to respect black authority, which means that when black folks are then telling me this is what's real, this is what's happening, this is what our history is, I'm not going to question that as if I know better than the person who's lived the experience. So I had that experience. I went to integrated schools. Those schools, thank God for deseg and integration in the schools that I attended. They're about 40% black during the time that I was in those institutions. That was a very important social lesson. I played baseball and basketball on teams that were mostly black kids. I remember going in 1980 out to, I think it was Jolton, maybe Mount Pleasant, 20 miles out or whatever it is from here. And my ball team went out there to play a scrimmage baseball team, and it was mostly black kids, me and a couple other white guys. And the guys we were supposed to play from that smaller rural area refused to play us because they didn't want to step on the field with black players, I guess. And they surrounded us, threatened us with baseball bats. We're calling the black kids the N-word, calling the white kids N-word lovers. And it's that kind of experience. This is 1980. This is not 1950. That's the kind of experience that lets you know that there are people who have been raised to draw a line between humanity on the basis of race. And they've decided that because you throw down with these kids and you play with these kids and these are your friends, that you've crossed that line. To me, that was a huge lesson about what's wrong with this country, not just the South, because this is a problem all around the country. It's just that, we talk about it more because we know perhaps that race is the background noise of everything in the South, and everywhere else they just don't realize it. At least white folks don't, black folks do. But growing up in that, you experience a little bit of what your friends are going through. You see it. I saw the mistreatment. I saw the way that teachers spoke differently to my black friends in school. I saw the way they were disciplined more harshly, even though we all acted like fools. We all did the same stuff. I saw the way that the white kids I went to high school with, we would have, keg parties where there was active drug use. Cops would come onto the property to tell us to turn down the music, and not once did anybody ever get arrested. But when I would talk to my black friends about that, and like, why don't you come to the parties? Why do you think we don't come to the parties? We're not going to, because we know that if we're there will be arrests. It will be a different thing. That's the kind of thing some of which I grappled with at the time, some of which I didn't grapple with for many years later. But all of that shaped me, and being a child of desegregation and integration and having the parents that I had, obviously helped with that.
When I have conversations with my African-American friends and non-white friends, we often say, we would rather someone show a little bit more of that overt racism from the baseball example you just gave than kind of, I'll smile in your face, I'll be real cool with you, and as soon as you leave, I'm telling a racist joke, or I have an epithet against you. And we just did an episode not too long ago called Nashville Nice. Talks about the politeness and the gentility that happens here in the city. And, I just kind of couple with that with this idea of race and how we approach it. Like some people say, let's not talk about race. Let's not talk about whiteness because it's very uncomfortable and it makes me uncomfortable. And I don't want you to trigger us. So how can we really begin to confront the social construct of whiteness and race, yet people are sensitive and touchy about it?
Well, the one thing we have to do is to make sure that those state lawmakers who in their infinite wisdom or lack thereof have decided that teachers can't talk about these things in schools, that we're not supposed to talk about What we're talking about right now would be considered, essentially unlawful by lawmakers in this state, as has been the case in, a dozen other states around the country that have either passed or are trying to pass legislation to restrict the teaching of this very topic because it makes white people uncomfortable. It makes white folks uncomfortable to talk about systemic racism or to talk about history accurately. Never mind what makes black people uncomfortable, which is actual racism, actual injustice, actual inequality. So first of all, we have to grow up. And we have to demand of our lawmakers, the people who are actually passing legislation, that they have no right to dictate the terms of what we're going to talk about and what we're going to learn about. Because if you don't talk about those things, if you don't practice discussing racism and learning how to be uncomfortable and sit with the discomfort and move through it, then you don't exercise that muscle that you need to have those deeper conversations. And we end up feeling fragile and vulnerable. And, oh my gosh, this makes me uncomfortable. We wouldn't have to feel this way if we had decided 20 years ago to have the conversations that we should have been having, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. The longer we kick the can down the road, the less prepared our children are going to be to have these conversations. And that clearly isn't working for anyone in this society. So,
what about that person who considers themselves to be a good person? They may not hold racist beliefs, but they rest in the comfort of their privilege. What can they do? What's your message to them?
I think there's a lot of things, and we don't have time to go through all of them, obviously. I think that for the person, look, I think most people are good people. I think what we have to recognize is that good people get caught up in bad systems, right? And that means they're teachers who are well-intended, but they get caught up in an educational system that was not created for equity. So we have to fix that system. It isn't about changing that person. It's fixing the system. There are people who become police officers who I know go into it for the right reason. But if you become part of a system that is predicated on controlling certain people for the benefit of other people, which is what law enforcement historically has been in this society, then all of your good intentions oftentimes will come to nothing. So I think part of it is letting go of the idea that there's good and bad people. Of course there are. But the problem is institutional. Be hard on systems and soft on people. I'm willing to extend grace to people who mess up. And I think we all deserve a degree of grace when we mess up. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to do the wrong thing. We're going to screw up, right? But institutional injustice is what we ought to be focused on. And I feel like we just don't do that enough.
Last question for you. What do you want people to know about the construct of whiteness and what they can do?
They need to know that it's not real. And that, James Baldwin said it best about white folks. He said, as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. And what he meant by that was not that whiteness wasn't real as a social thing. It was. But if you actually believe in it, if you actually put more value in the color of skin than you do in the humanity of all of society, you're doomed. And you're not going to live up to what America was intended to be. We were promised that this country was one thing, and it has never been that thing. So you have a choice. You either choose multiracial democracy, multicultural democracy, or you choose some form of white nationalist authoritarianism. Those are the only two choices. There's no middle ground. You're either going to be white or you're going to be an American. And you can't be both, because to some extent being white means violating all of the principles of America that we were raised to believe were real, but have actually just been, this sort of myth that we've constructed over a long period of time.
Tim Wise, anti-racism writer, educator, and native Nashvilleian. I want to thank you so much for the show. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk with people who are confronting their own privilege and continue to join the conversation. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. We've been talking this hour about the social construct of whiteness and its history here in Tennessee. Now we want to talk about why it's important to name and talk about whiteness in the present day. I'd like to introduce my next guest. Molly Secor is the author of White Privilege Pop Quiz, a book that helps people confront their own white privilege. Molly, thanks so much for being here. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
So tell me, did you grow up thinking about whiteness and white privilege?
I did not grow up thinking about whiteness or white privilege. I didn't think about it until the late 90s, really. I grew up in a town where there was one black person that I knew of, and I'm pretty sure he was the only one, and he was adopted. And his name was Lyle Baxter, and he was the most popular guy in school. He was voted most funny, most handsome, the whole thing. So I grew up thinking that this French-Canadian American town that I grew up on the border, that there was no such thing as racism because we all liked Lyle Baxter. And we talked about him at dinner, and I actually brought him out as a party favor. And I'd go to my friend's house who didn't go to Catholic school, which we had. Lyle went and I went to, and I would go to my friend's house, and I remember the reason I used to do a thing called Whispering Black. Because I remember at this one particular dinner, I was telling her about this guy at school who is really cool and he's really smart and he's a really good basketball player and he's really popular and he's black. And I whispered it at the dinner table at my friend's house when I was probably 11.
Okay.
So I knew enough back then to whisper the word black. I didn't know why I did it, but I did.
So what was the moment or the experience that got you on this track that you're on now?
Oh, gosh. Okay, there's probably two experiences. One is one of those, I was on my way on the airplane to move to Nashville, Tennessee to be with the man that I came here to be with and eventually married. And I was on the plane. I had never visited Nashville. He was moving here. I was coming here to be with him. I was on the plane, and in my head, I was going, what the heck are you doing moving to Nashville, Tennessee? I'd never been south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Okay.
And I heard a voice come through as quick as I asked the question that said, there's a lot of work around racism, and that's what you're going to do. And I was kind of shocked. And 3 years later, I was working at a nonprofit with at-risk teens, and I noticed that 90-some% of the people that we were serving were non-white, and the counselors and the helpers, about 87% were white women. And that's when I began to start asking, why is this? And I went to the Race Relations Institute that summer. I took my summer vacation and went there, and that's where I met Tim Wise. I met Dr. Ray Winbush, Naomi Tutu, and it was the beginning of a long season, I would say, many years of me sort of breaking down this thing called whiteness.
So as you've been spending these seasons breaking down this construct of whiteness, what does that look like for you? How have you come to grapple with some of those maybe whispering black moments that you've had?
Well, for me, because I'm a writer, I've written about them. So for about 10 years, I wrote columns for the Nashville City paper, the Tennessean, Nashville Scene. Then I was a columnist for the Huffington Post. So my way of working this out was through writing and bringing it so that other people could wrestle with me. And that was basically, and the book, The White Privilege Pop Quiz, is really just 20 years of wrestling. I came up with 13 questions that I'd never asked myself. And I thought, okay, maybe this will be valuable. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I wrote from a place of inquiry. I wanted to know, what was this thing called whiteness, and how did it unravel, and how to unravel it, but how did it show up every day when I didn't see it? And when in the very beginning, I ran into, at the Race Relations Institute at Fisk, I spoke to a woman named Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who was a black psychologist, very prominent, and she spent about 30 minutes with me in the lobby. This was my entry into this. I was one of the very few white people at this conference. And she said, so now that you understand that you have white privilege, what are you going to do about it? And I stammered and stuttered, and I started, my family, my parents divorced, and we had public assistance, so I didn't really have white privilege. And that's where I was starting. And I went home every night of that conference in tears, because I was being confronted with things that I perceived myself a hip, white artist, white woman. I was welcoming of everyone and everybody, and I didn't know how much work I had to do.
My next guest has been working to confront their own privilege over the years. David Dark is an associate professor of religion and the arts at Belmont University and the author of the upcoming book, Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. And Danielle Simpler is a Nashville resident and mother of two. I want to thank you both for being with us today. David, let me ask you, you're a Nashville native as well.
Yes.
And I understand you really started thinking about whiteness differently after you saw a particular set of movies. Is that right?
Yes, I saw Mississippi Burning, which turned me around a little bit. I had grown up, I went to Franklin Road Academy, which was lovely, but I came to understand that Franklin Road Academy here in Nashville started out as a segregation academy. And it was probably Mississippi Burning that got me thinking harder about Confederate symbols and that kind of thing. And then I saw Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing at Vanderbilt Surratt Cinema in 1989. There was a panel discussion, and it happens that Spike Lee's sister, Joey Lee, was in the cast, as was Giancarlo Esposito. It was a predominantly black audience, and Giancarlo Esposito expressed gratitude for who he referred to as the sisters and brothers in the audience. And then he said he wanted to see more sisters and brothers in the film industry. I was 19, and I felt, this is a memory that I should say has surfaced in recent years as I've tried to make sense of things. I felt a little triggered by that, and I got to thinking that during the Q&A, I would stand up and ask Giancarlo Esposito, after praising the film, I would say, am I a brother? And if not, why not? I did not have the courage to ask that question, but I did, and this is a confession, I'm ashamed of this now, I did recount the story to people. It became a kind of rhetorical flex that I now understand to be a form of white grievance. I should say as well, I never told that story to black people because I wasn't interested in being vulnerable in that way. And as I try to figure out how we are where we are, I'm 52, lifelong Nashvilleian. I can well understand that if my identity had gone south, as it were, and if I had become someone who could channel white grievance with something of the passion that I felt in 1989, I understand how whiteness could become a form of currency in accruing cred and coin in the state of Tennessee.
Thank you for sharing that story. Now, Danielle, was race something your family talked about when you were growing up?
It was not. My biological father was openly racist, and I grew up feeling very uncomfortable about that, and I believe it also made my mother feel uncomfortable as well. I remember the comments, and it was something that I grew up knowing that I wanted to do differently.
Well, so when did you start your journey and how?
I would say my late teen years was when I really realized I wanted to do things differently. And then I had my son when I was 20, and having this human in my life that I was responsible for raising, I knew that I wanted to educate him from the beginning and to make sure that he grew up to be a conscious human that was educated on race and that used his privilege for good, you know, that he acknowledged it and that he did something.
So as you're entering this journey of understanding whiteness, understanding race, understanding your privilege, what did you come to recognize initially? Like, what did you realize about the world that you hadn't before?
I realized how many of us are racist, you know, and we don't even realize it. And I think that's something that I really appreciated about Molly's book and the pop quiz is just facing these things that we don't recognize in ourselves without, you know, it being brought to our attention. And I found that to be really eye-opening, and I was ashamed.
That's something that David expressed as well. I imagine with anything, it's not just, I mean, obviously I'm not white, but there's rooms of my existence that I have to question and ask myself and come to recognize where, oh, Khalil, you might not be on the right side of this. This is something that you can learn. And there is some little level of shame that comes in. Molly,
There is.
yeah, I want to ask this to Molly. You know, as we are going through these changes and these moves of self-evolution, so to speak, how can we, I don't want to say ameliorate the pain and from really messing with us, but how can we come to be comfortable with that pain, with that discomfort, so we can become this better person we're aspiring to?
I think it's a great question. And I'm not sure it's about getting comfortable so much with the pain, but accepting the pain. And accepting that, yes, this is a very painful thing to acknowledge in the very beginning when you're looking at this stuff. But again, we have to realize that, and I agree that we are all, for me, I think that I am racist. I'm going to be less racist by the time I die, but from where I started, it's in the water. I mean, we're indoctrinated because this is the culture, this is the society. And unless you have the intent and the dedication to undo it, and it is something that needs to be undone because this is systemic. It's not a personal thing. It's systemic. Racism is a tool that upholds white supremacy. And it's very simple when you look at it. I mean, it's complex the way it plays out, but it's very simple in its intent and its origins. But in terms of, we have to recognize that whether we're talking about alcoholism or addiction or racism, guilt and feeling bad and self-loathing serves no purpose whatsoever. You can feel self-conscious, and yes, of course, there's going to be feelings of you're going to feel sad. You're going to feel when you realize the part that perhaps you've played, but there's no room for it. I mean, the whole idea is for us to move better and higher and be all that we are meant, that we came here to be. So there's not really, and I think sometimes people use guilt as a way to not do it. It's a way to dig your heels in resistance.
Now, David, how are you talking to people about whiteness these days?
I want to speak of whiteness as something that I am divesting from, that I believe I'll be divesting from for the rest of my life. And I want to encourage folks, maybe through my own example, to see what's on the other side of shame. Shame is toxic. Shame is abuse in a way. But if I'm not willing to risk ashamed feelings, I'm not willing to entertain the moral realizations that can help me evolve and be a more full, undivided human being.
Now, a conversation I was having, particularly with a lot of friends in 2020 after George Floyd, talking about whiteness, talking about racism. And you mentioned this a little bit, Molly. If you're born and raised in America, you're going to be a little bit racist. You're going to be a little bit misogynist. I mean, because it is in the water supply and in the soil. How does that play out differently for white women as opposed to white men? And how does that kind of perpetuate this myth that we have?
That's a great question and a great point. And it's complicated and it's hot because white women have played this role of we've been complicit historically. There was a complicity among women at the same time as being part of the oppressed, being oppressed. So again, it was that you were in alignment with the perpetrator. And so that made you complicit. And I'm sure that, over the decades and centuries, it was very, very difficult because there were a lot of women, there were white women who did not believe in slavery, who knew that it was wrong, but also they were married to someone who was, and they had no rights. They had no, they were beholden to the person who was, or the representative of the system. And so I think it's always been a tough, when we talk about, I had this conversation with someone yesterday, not that long ago when there were lynchings, public lynchings. I mean, women made the picnic baskets and they went and celebrated when there was someone being lynched. So there's always been cooperation at the same time as being a victim of the system. So it's very muddy and complicated. And I think that's also something that's, when we start talking about that, what Tim mentioned, something about seeing the angry faces as the young children walk through the neighborhoods for the first time during integration. I mean, there were men, women, children, older people, white people who were taunting and torturing people of color. And, there's nobody in the family that wasn't part of that.
I really appreciate all of you being on the show. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all the time we have. There's so many questions, as I like to say, that we have to leave on the cutting room floor. Really appreciate you all. Hopefully we can have this conversation again. I want to thank my guests, Molly Secor. She's the author of White Privilege Pop Quiz, David Dark, professor at Belmont, and Danielle Simpler. Thanks again to you all for being here for this very important conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank everyone who tuned in this hour. Tomorrow, we'll talk with Democrat Dr. Jason Martin, who is running to replace Governor Bill Lee. Tune in. This is Nashville is a production of WPLN News and Nashville Public Radio. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Our producers are Steve Harouche, Rose Gilbert, and Magnolia McKay. Our digital lead is Anna Gallegos-Cannon. Michaela Elias is our technical director. Our executive producer is Andrea Tudhope. Shout out to our intern, Tori Hoover. The masterminds behind our theme music are Laurent and Namir Blade. Special thanks to Blaze Gainey. And the conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Find us on Instagram and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekalona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. And be good to each other.